I realized something was wrong only after I had already swallowed the pills. They went down like they always did, with a sip of lukewarm water and the quiet belief that at least this part of my life was still under my control. But within minutes, my body reacted in a way it never had before. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to make me pause, hand still resting on the counter, heart beating a little too fast for no clear reason. I stood there, waiting for the familiar rhythm to return. It didn't. That was when it hit me. I hadn't changed anything. I hadn't skipped a dose. I hadn't taken it late. I had followed the schedule exactly as it had been updated. The word echoed in my head, sharp and unsettling. Updated by who? In that moment, it became painfully clear that this wasn't a mistake. Someone had decided something about my body without me, and I had only found out after the decision had already passed through me. My sister had said she was helping. She'd said it lightly, almost casually, the way people do when they expect gratitude instead of questions. We were sitting at the kitchen table a few days earlier, sunlight cutting across the surface, when she mentioned the adjustment as if she were commenting on the weather. She told everyone she'd shifted my medication schedule just a little. Nothing major, nothing to worry about. She'd already cleared it, she said, waving her hand as if that ended the discussion. My parents looked relieved. Someone was handling it. Someone capable. Someone decisive. I remember opening my mouth, then closing it again. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself she meant well. I told myself that if there had been a real change, I would have been consulted. That last thought stayed with me longer than the others. After that conversation, things moved quickly but quietly. Reminders stopped coming from my phone and started coming from her. Appointments were taken care of. Instructions were summarized for me instead of discussed. People stopped asking me how I was feeling and started asking her how I was doing. It happened so smoothly that I almost missed it. At first it felt like relief. I was tired after all. Letting someone else manage the details sounded reasonable. She spoke with confidence, the kind that makes other people lean back in their chairs and nod. She used words like easier and safer and consistent. No one questioned her, and I didn't want to be the only one who did. The first time I mentioned feeling off, I did it carefully. I wasn't accusing anyone. I wasn't upset. I said it the way you mention a headache you expect to pass. My sister smiled. Not sharply, not unkindly. She told me my body was probably just adjusting. My parents agreed. Stress, they said. I'd been under a lot of it lately. Someone even joked that I'd always been sensitive. The words settled into the room and stayed there. After that, I learned to measure my words. Each time I considered pushing back, I imagined the look that would follow. Concern mixed with doubt. The unspoken question of whether I was overreacting. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. I especially didn't want to confirm the idea that I couldn't be trusted with my own reactions. So I stopped explaining. Instead, I started noticing things. I noticed that decisions were being made before I was informed of them. I noticed that when people talked about my health, they used her phrases, not mine. I noticed how often she said we instead of I, as if my agreement had already been given. I also noticed how my body responded when I followed the new schedule. The reactions weren't dramatic enough to cause alarm, but they were consistent enough to raise questions. Questions I kept to myself. There was a moment, one afternoon, when my sister corrected me in front of everyone. I had mentioned the time I usually took my medication, and she laughed softly and said, "No, that wasn't right anymore." She said it with such certainty that the conversation moved on before I could respond. I sat there, hands folded, listening to my own routine being rewritten out loud. That was when I understood something important. This wasn't just about medication. It was about who was allowed to speak with authority and who wasn't. And right now, my voice didn't carry much weight. The thought should have scared me more than it did. Instead, it sharpened something inside me. That night, alone in my room, I considered confronting her. I ran through the words in my head, imagined the explanations, the defenses, the way the conversation would spiral into tone and intention and feelings. I knew how that story ended. I'd be emotional. She'd be reasonable. Everyone else would be uncomfortable, and nothing would change. So I made a different choice. I decided to stop reacting and start observing. I stopped correcting small inaccuracies. I stopped clarifying. I let her speak for me, even when it made my jaw tighten. I listened closely to the details she added, the way her story shifted depending on who was in the room. Most importantly, I started thinking about what hadn't changed. If the schedule had really been adjusted, there would be a record, a note, a confirmation, something official. Changes like that didn't exist only in conversation. They lived on paper, in charts and timestamps and instructions that didn't care who sounded confident. The realization settled in quietly, but it stayed. If everything had truly been updated, it would exist somewhere beyond her voice. And if it didn't, then sooner or later the difference would matter. I realized my sister's version of events was spreading faster than I could keep up with it. People already seemed to know about the change before I mentioned anything myself. A cousin asked how the new schedule was working. A family friend told me it was good I had someone on top of things. They all used the same language, the same phrasing, like they were quoting from a script they'd rehearsed together. It didn't take long to understand where it was coming from. She spoke with confidence, and confidence traveled well. By the time I entered a room, the story had already arrived ahead of me, neatly packaged and reassuring. My role in it was passive. I was the subject, not the source. At first, I tried to participate. When someone asked how I was feeling, I answered honestly. But halfway through my sentence, my sister would gently step in. She clarified. She summarized. She adjusted my words into something smoother, something easier to accept. No one seemed to notice the interruption. It was subtle enough to feel considerate. I noticed. Eventually, people stopped asking me directly. Questions drifted toward her without hesitation. How was I doing? Was the schedule helping? Was everything under control? She answered each one, calm and composed, as if she'd been appointed to the role without a vote. Once, I corrected her. Just once. She'd mentioned a time that didn't match what I was actually doing, and I said so. The room went quiet for a beat, and then she smiled and said, "I must be thinking of the old routine." She said it lightly, without challenge, and someone laughed as if it were a harmless mix-up. The conversation moved on. My correction didn't. I learned something in that moment. Accuracy mattered less than delivery. Her certainty outweighed my experience, and no one wanted to disrupt the balance she'd created by questioning it. She framed everything as help. She was easing my burden. She was making things simpler. She talked about how overwhelming it could be to manage details when you weren't feeling your best. The praise came easily. People thanked her. They told her how lucky I was. I smiled when they said it. I stayed quiet. Meanwhile, my life began to feel like something being managed rather than lived. Notifications came through her. Decisions were presented as updates, not discussions. I found out about appointments after they were scheduled. When I asked questions, the answers came filtered, softened, sometimes delayed. There was a strange disorientation that came with it. Not panic, not anger, just the steady sense that I was slightly out of sync with my own routines. One evening, she described my schedule incorrectly in front of everyone. It was a small detail, but it was wrong. I felt it immediately, like a note played off key. I looked around the room, waiting for someone else to catch it. No one did. I considered speaking up. The words were right there, simple and factual. But I hesitated. I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't interrupt her confidence. I wanted to see how much weight her certainty really carried. So I stayed silent. She finished her explanation without hesitation. Heads nodded. Someone repeated her words back to me as if they were now established fact. I felt the shift happen in real time. The incorrect detail settled into place, reinforced by repetition. That was when it became clear that this wasn't about a single adjustment. It was about narrative control. Whoever told the story first, and with the most assurance, got to define reality. The cost of speaking up revealed itself gradually. Each time I mentioned feeling off, the response followed a familiar pattern. Stress, fatigue, anxiety. My sister never contradicted me outright. She simply reframed my experience until it sounded manageable, explainable, temporary. I watched how easily concern could turn into dismissal. The more she spoke for me, the more composed she appeared. The more I tried to explain myself, the more fragile I seemed by comparison. It wasn't malicious. It didn't need to be. The structure favored her calm authority over my lived experience. I started replaying recent interactions in my head. Each conversation followed the same arc. I would express something uncertain. She would translate it into something definitive. Others would accept her version and move on. It wasn't just the schedule she was managing, it was how my health was understood. That realization settled heavily. I wasn't losing control through confrontation or conflict. I was losing it through agreement I had never given. So I stopped offering corrections. I stopped clarifying. I answered questions briefly when I had to, and otherwise let her speak. I listened closely, not just to what she said, but to how often she said it. How her explanations expanded with each telling, growing more detailed, more confident, more difficult to challenge. I noticed something else, too. Her story needed constant repetition. It had to be reinforced, retold, adjusted slightly each time to fit the listener. It wasn't stable. It depended on momentum. And momentum, I realized, could be watched. By the end of that week, the pattern was unmistakable. She wasn't just changing how my medication was handled, she was changing how others perceived my ability to understand and manage my own body. Each time she spoke, the gap widened. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't even tell myself what I planned to do next. I just paid attention. Because if her version of events was as solid as she believed, it wouldn't need to be repeated so often. And if it wasn't, then sooner or later, the truth would surface in the one place she hadn't touched yet. The part of the story that didn't change just because someone spoke confidently enough. The first crack in my sister's story appeared in the most ordinary way. We were standing in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the pauses between conversation, when she casually mentioned the time I was supposed to take my evening dose. She said it without hesitation, as if it had always been that way. The words landed softly, but something inside me went still. That time wasn't right. I knew my routine. I had lived inside it for years, long enough for it to settle into muscle memory. I knew when my body expected the medication and how it responded when it arrived. What she said didn't line up with any of it. I felt the instinctive urge to correct her rise and stop in my throat. The words were simple. I could have said them easily, but instead, I watched her face. Calm, certain, already moving on. I said nothing. The room accepted her version without hesitation. No one questioned it. No one looked to me for confirmation. Someone repeated her words back as if they were now a fact everyone had agreed on together. In that moment, I learned how fragile truth could be when confidence stepped in front of it. I decided to test the room without speaking. Not as a game, not as a trap, but as an experiment. I wanted to see how much weight her certainty carried on its own. Over the next few days, she repeated the same detail to different people. Each time, the reaction was the same. Nods, understanding, reassurance. The wrong information traveled smoothly, untouched by doubt. Once, someone asked me directly if it was working. I paused, choosing my words carefully. Before I could finish, my sister filled the silence. She explained that it was an adjustment period, that these things took time. Her tone was soothing, practiced. The person turned to her fully. I faded back into the background of my own story. That night, alone, I replayed the conversation again and again. I didn't trust memory alone. I trusted patterns. I thought through my routine step by step. When I took the medication, how I felt before and after. Nothing matched what she had described. I wasn't confused. I wasn't mistaken. I was being overridden. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me clear. I understood then that this wasn't about a single detail. It was about who was allowed to define reality. And right now, my sister was doing it effortlessly, not because she was right, but because no one challenged her. Her confidence grew as my voice went quiet. She began adding details I hadn't shared, filling in gaps with assumptions that sounded reasonable enough to pass without scrutiny. She spoke as if she had a complete picture of my health, my needs, my limits. People praised her for it. They admired how composed she was, how well she handled everything. I watched as the role she had stepped into solidified around her. I considered correcting her again. Just once. I imagined how it would sound, calm, polite, factual. I imagined the looks that would follow. Concern, confusion. The subtle shift where I became the problem for disrupting the flow. I didn't want to protect her, but I also didn't want to protect the version of the story she was building. That was when it clicked. Correcting her now wouldn't weaken her position. It would strengthen it. It would give her the opportunity to explain, to justify, to refine her narrative in response to resistance. It would make the story more durable. So I let it stand. I started paying attention to the way she spoke about me when she thought I wasn't listening. The language changed depending on the audience. With family, she emphasized care and responsibility. With friends, she highlighted how complex my situation was, how much oversight it required. Each version served the same purpose. It positioned her as the steady one and me as someone who needed managing. I began to see the pattern clearly. Every small decision she made increased her authority. Every time I stayed silent, that authority expanded. It was unsettling to watch, but it was also instructive. I wasn't witnessing an accident. I was watching a system at work. There was a cost to my silence, and I felt it in quiet moments. In the way people spoke around me instead of to me. In the way my own confidence wavered when I tried to assert something simple. It would have been easier to push back emotionally, to insist on being heard. But ease wasn't my goal anymore. I told myself to wait, to let the story grow exactly as she was shaping it, to let it become as detailed and specific as possible. Stories built on assumptions collapse more cleanly when they've been allowed to fully form. I noticed something else as the days passed. The more she talked, the more she contradicted herself. Small things. Times that shifted slightly. Reasons that changed depending on who was listening. Nothing obvious enough to call out, but enough to mark. I stored those details away without reacting. By the end of the week, I wasn't wondering if something was wrong anymore. I knew it was, and I knew it wasn't accidental. This wasn't about helping me manage my health. It was about managing the narrative around it, and she was being rewarded for it in ways she likely didn't even recognize. I decided then to let her keep going. If she wanted to speak for me, I would let her. If she wanted to build a version of events that rested entirely on her voice, I wouldn't interrupt it. I would watch it take shape, layer by layer, until it reached a point where it couldn't be adjusted anymore. Because the more complete her story became, the harder it would be for her to step back from it later. And when that moment came, I wanted the truth to be waiting exactly where it always had. Unmoved, unchanged, written down. I stopped defending myself on purpose. It wasn't a retreat, and it wasn't exhaustion. It was a decision made quietly. After I realized that every time I explained myself, I was reinforcing the position my sister had already taken. The more I tried to clarify, the more she looked like the responsible one managing something fragile. So I stepped back. I didn't announce it. I didn't tell anyone I was changing how I responded. I simply stopped correcting small inaccuracies. I stopped filling in gaps when people looked confused. I let conversations move forward without my input, even when I felt the urge to interrupt. Almost immediately a space opened up, and my sister stepped into it without hesitation. She began handling things without checking with me first. Not in a dramatic way, in the same calm, practical tone she always used. She scheduled, adjusted, confirmed. I learned about decisions after they were made, often in passing, as if they were too minor to revisit. No one questioned the shift. It happened so smoothly that it felt natural, as though this had always been how things were meant to be. At first, I struggled with the disorientation. I would reach for my phone to check something and realize I hadn't been included. Messages arrived filtered through her, summarized instead of shared. Details were softened, sometimes delayed. It was like living one step behind my own life. I noticed how quickly people adjusted. They stopped looping me into conversations that involved my health. They spoke around me instead of to me, glancing in my direction only after she had answered. My presence became ceremonial. I was there, but I wasn't consulted. Once I found out about an appointment while we were already driving to it. She said it casually, as if she were reminding me of something I had agreed to. I stared out the window and said nothing. Inside, something tightened, then settled. The more I withdrew, the more confident she became. Her language changed subtly. Where she used to say, "I think," or "I'm helping," she started saying, "We decided." It was a small shift, but it carried weight. We implied agreement. We erased the need for consent. No one challenged it. I began to understand how power accumulates in silence. It doesn't need force, it just needs space. There were moments when the imbalance felt unbearable. Times when I wanted to speak up just to feel real again. But I reminded myself why I was doing this. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to understand the system that had formed around me. And the system was revealing itself clearly. The benefits of not interrupting became apparent quickly. Without resistance, my sister talked more. She filled the space with explanations, justifications, timelines. The details grew longer, more specific, less careful. She wasn't refining her story anymore, she was expanding it. And expansion created errors. I started noticing contradictions I would have missed before. Times that shifted by hours. Reasons that changed depending on the audience. Statements that couldn't all be true at once. I didn't react to any of them, I simply took note. Silence sharpened my attention. I also noticed how she spoke when she thought I wasn't listening. The tone was different, less cautious, more assured. She talked about my health as if it were a project she was overseeing, something she had brought under control. People praised her for it. They admired how steady she was, how composed. The social reward was obvious. She was being seen as competent, reliable, indispensable. And I saw the endgame forming. This wasn't just about helping me. It was about the position she had gained by doing so. The authority, the validation. The role she now occupied in the family dynamic. Stepping back from it would mean losing all of that. I realized then that the more she spoke for me, the harder it would be for her to stop. That understanding changed how I felt about waiting. It stopped feeling passive. It became strategic. I let the process continue. I let her make assumptions publicly. I let her present decisions as settled. I let her confidence go unchecked. Every time she spoke without verifying, she committed herself further to a version of events that existed only in conversation. There was a moment, late one evening, when I overheard her explaining my situation to someone over the phone. She used a phrase I had never used, describing a limitation I didn't recognize. The person on the other end murmured sympathetically. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I felt something solidify inside me, a certainty that this couldn't continue indefinitely, that there would be a point where words would no longer be enough to support what she was claiming. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was focused. I understood that silence wasn't the absence of action. It was the groundwork for it. Every day I didn't correct her, she added another layer to a story that couldn't be sustained by facts. And when the moment came for that story to be examined, it wouldn't be my emotions on trial. It would be hers. By stepping back, I had given her exactly what she wanted. Control, authority, the freedom to speak without interruption. What she didn't realize was that she was also building something she wouldn't be able to dismantle later. A version of events so complete, so confident, so unchallenged, that when it finally met reality, there would be nowhere for it to retreat. I stayed quiet and let it grow. I checked the records without telling anyone I was doing it. There was no dramatic moment where I decided to investigate, no surge of anger or rush of adrenaline. I simply reached a point where assuming was no longer acceptable. If something about my medication had truly changed, there would be a trace of it somewhere beyond my sister's voice. So one afternoon, while the house was quiet, I sat down and looked. I approached it the way I always had, calmly and methodically. I pulled up the official schedule, the same one I'd followed for years. I read through it slowly, line by line, not searching for proof, just checking. Dates, dosages, timing, notes. Everything was still there. Nothing had been updated, nothing revised, no addendums. No approvals, no subtle shifts buried in fine print. The schedule existed exactly as it always had, steady and unchanged, as if the past few weeks of conversation had never happened. The absence of change was louder than any confirmation could have been. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. A separate note, a verbal instruction that hadn't been logged yet. I checked again, then a third time. Each pass led to the same conclusion. There was no adjustment. Not officially, not medically, not anywhere that mattered. I sat there longer than I needed to, letting the realization settle. The doubt I'd been carrying evaporated quietly. I wasn't confused. I wasn't mistaken. I hadn't misunderstood anything. The discrepancy was real, and it wasn't small. Her certainty existed only in conversation. I began reconstructing the timeline in my head. When she said the change happened, who she told first, how the details shifted depending on the listener. I placed those moments against the documented dates, watching how they failed to align. Her story moved freely. The records did not. That difference mattered more than I had expected. It grounded me in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. The sense of being off balance, of second-guessing myself, began to fade. I trusted what was written. I trusted what hadn't changed. And I understood something else just as clearly. Revealing this now would accomplish nothing. If I confronted her immediately, she would adjust. She would explain. She would reframe the discrepancy as a misunderstanding or an oversight. The story would bend, not break. It would become more careful, more polished. I wasn't interested in polishing it. So I kept what I'd found to myself. I didn't take screenshots. I didn't print anything out. I didn't even write it down. I committed the details to memory instead. The exact wording, the timestamps, the absence of any revision. I wanted to know it well enough that I wouldn't need to reach for it later. This wasn't about catching her in a lie. It was about letting the truth remain untouched until it was forced into the open. As the days passed, the risk became harder to ignore. Following her version of the schedule meant continuing to feel the effects I'd already noticed. The physical symptoms intensified slightly, enough to disrupt my routine, enough to make the consequences real. There were moments when I wondered if I was pushing myself too far, if waiting was becoming dangerous. The thought unsettled me, but it also clarified something important. This wasn't sustainable. She had crossed from narrative control into real-world impact. The discrepancy between what she said and what was written wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was affecting my body. That knowledge shifted my internal boundary. I still didn't confront her, but I began thinking differently about what would need to happen next. Not a fight, not an accusation, a check, something neutral, something procedural. A situation where her version of events would have to stand on its own. She, meanwhile, grew more comfortable. Her explanations became more casual, more confident. She spoke about my schedule as if it were settled, finalized, beyond question. Each time she did, she moved further away from anything that could be reconciled with the records. I listened closely. I noticed how often she referenced approvals that didn't exist, how she implied conversations that hadn't happened, how she filled gaps with certainty instead of verification. And I said nothing. I organized what I knew into a quiet mental file. Not evidence in the traditional sense, more like a map, a clear understanding of where her story diverged from reality and how far that divergence had gone. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt focused. There was a strange calm that came with knowing the truth so clearly while everyone else accepted a different version. It wasn't satisfying, it was isolating, but it was also stabilizing. The facts didn't care who believed them. One evening, as she explained my situation again to someone new, I watched how easily the story flowed. How little effort it took now. She wasn't checking herself anymore. She assumed coherence where none existed. That was when I knew she had no idea how exposed she was. Her version relied entirely on her ability to keep speaking without interruption, without documentation, without scrutiny. The moment it had to exist outside of conversation, it would fail. I didn't rush that moment. I let the days pass. I followed instructions outwardly while holding the truth inwardly. I endured the discomfort because I understood what it was buying me. Time. Time for her story to become complete enough that it couldn't be rewritten. Time for the contrast between words and records to sharpen. Time for the difference to matter to someone other than me. I wasn't waiting for revenge. I was waiting for alignment. Because eventually, her certainty would be placed next to something that didn't bend, something that didn't respond to confidence or intention or tone. And when that happened, there would be no need for me to say anything at all. The records would speak on their own. She called it a small adjustment, the kind you barely notice. She said it over breakfast, her voice calm, almost reassuring, as if she were smoothing a wrinkle in a tablecloth. "Just for a few days," she explained, "just to make things easier." I didn't argue. I nodded and let the moment pass, even though something in my chest tightened the instant she said it. This felt different. By the afternoon, my body confirmed it. The reaction came faster this time, heavier than before. My hands trembled slightly when I tried to steady them. My head felt thick, like I was moving through fog. I sat down and waited for it to pass, telling myself it would because it always had. It didn't. I lay there longer than I meant to, listening to the sounds of the house around me, measuring my breath, trying to decide if this was still within the range of acceptable discomfort or something else entirely. The line I'd been walking so carefully suddenly felt too thin. For the first time, I wondered if staying silent was putting me in real danger. The thought followed me through the rest of the day. Every movement felt slightly off, every sensation amplified. I moved carefully, deliberately, as if my body were no longer something I could trust without question. I considered saying something. I even rehearsed the words in my head, simple and direct. "This doesn't feel right." But I knew what would happen next. She would reassure, others would agree. Someone would say my body needed time. The story would absorb my concern and move forward unchanged, and the risk would remain mine alone. That night, she spoke about the change openly, as if it were settled. She explained it to my parents, her tone confident and precise. She referenced times and reasons that didn't match what I was experiencing. I listened carefully, noting the differences. She contradicted herself once, then corrected it smoothly, not noticing the shift. No one else noticed either. Her confidence had crossed into carelessness. She no longer checked for my reaction. She no longer paused to make sure the details aligned. She assumed authority was enough. I realized then that she believed she was untouchable. The next morning, something happened that made the situation impossible to ignore. I stood up too quickly and felt the room tilt. It wasn't dramatic, I didn't fall, but I had to grab the counter to steady myself, my heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. I stayed there until the sensation passed, then slowly let go. That was the line. This wasn't about discomfort anymore. This was about safety, and whatever strategy I'd been following up to that point had to change. I didn't confront her, not yet. I didn't accuse or raise my voice or demand answers. Instead, I shifted my focus outward. If waiting was becoming dangerous, then the next step couldn't rely on endurance alone. It had to involve structure. I began positioning things carefully, subtly. I didn't ask for reviews. I didn't request meetings. I simply stopped shielding her version from contact with the systems that existed outside our family. I let routine processes unfold without interference. I made sure appointments stayed on the calendar. I allowed paperwork to circulate as it normally would. I didn't correct her when she volunteered to explain things. I let her. She stepped forward eagerly, assuming control without hesitation. She spoke as if everything were aligned, as if the details had already been handled. Watching her, I understood how completely she believed in the story she was telling. and how little she suspected it would be tested. The waiting was harder now. Knowing the risk had sharpened everything. Each day felt heavier, stretched thin by the effort of appearing compliant while holding firm inside. There were moments when fear crept in, quiet but insistent, asking if I was doing the right thing. I answered it with facts. I knew what the records said. I knew what hadn't changed. And I knew that the next time she explained my schedule, it wouldn't be in a casual conversation or over coffee. It would be somewhere that required precision. She didn't know that. She assumed my silence meant agreement. She assumed my lack of resistance meant consent. She expanded her role with confidence, filling gaps with certainty. I let her. One evening, she outlined my schedule again, this time in preparation for something upcoming. She spoke fluidly, without notes, without hesitation. I watched her carefully, recognizing details that couldn't all be true at once. She was committing herself fully now. I felt a strange mix of emotions then. Fear, yes, but also relief, because the path forward had become clear. Waiting indefinitely was no longer an option, but neither was confrontation. The only way out was through a process she couldn't control. I understood that I was past the point of hoping she would stop on her own. She had gone too far, not out of cruelty, but out of certainty. She believed she was right, and belief had carried her this far. It wouldn't carry her any further. As I lay awake that night, feeling my body slowly return to something like normal, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not let this escalate any further without accountability. Not through anger, not through argument, through exposure. The next time she explained everything, it would be under scrutiny. The next time she spoke with authority, her words would have to exist somewhere permanent. She slept peacefully, confident in the role she'd claimed. I stayed awake, steady and resolved, knowing that the story she'd built was about to meet something it couldn't adjust. And when that happened, silence would no longer be a risk. It would be my leverage. I began moving as if I agreed with everything. On the surface, nothing changed. I followed the schedule she gave me. I listened when she explained things. I nodded when decisions were presented as settled. If anyone had asked, they would have said I seemed calmer, easier, more cooperative. That was exactly what I wanted them to see. Inside, I was doing something else entirely. I was paying attention to timing, to phrasing, to who spoke first and who filled the silence. I stopped offering clarifications and watched how quickly she rushed to provide them instead. I stopped asking questions and noticed how often she volunteered answers no one had requested. Compliance, I learned, was excellent camouflage. I didn't challenge her version of events. I didn't correct dates or times. I didn't even show hesitation when details didn't match what I knew to be true. I let her confidence move unopposed through every room, knowing that confidence without verification tends to overreach. And it did. I began setting conditions without announcing them. I didn't orchestrate anything dramatic. I simply stepped aside and let ordinary processes take their natural course. Appointments remained on the calendar. Standard reviews weren't postponed. Routine paperwork circulated the way it always had. I didn't ask for checks. I just stopped preventing them. The first time someone else asked a question, I stayed silent. Not pointedly, not performatively. I just didn't rush to answer. The pause hung in the air long enough for my sister to step into it. She always did. She spoke quickly, filling gaps with reassurance, smoothing over uncertainty with explanations that sounded practiced. The longer she talked, the more comfortable she became. The more comfortable she became, the more she revealed. I noticed how her stories grew in length. She added context. She offered reasoning. She referenced conversations that hadn't happened and decisions that hadn't been documented. She wasn't lying outright. She was assuming coherence where none existed. And she was doing it out loud. I stayed quiet. There was a moment when someone asked a follow-up question, something simple about timing. I didn't respond. I watched her take a breath and answer for me, confident and precise. The date she mentioned wasn't right. No one challenged it. That was the pattern. Silence on my side invited explanation on hers. explanation led to detail, detail led to contradiction. I didn't interrupt when inaccuracies appeared. I didn't rescue her when she spoke past what could be supported. I let her build momentum without breaks. The power of not interrupting surprised me. I had always thought silence made you disappear. Instead, it turned her into the only voice in the room. And when there is only one voice, every mistake becomes traceable. I could see it happening even when others couldn't yet. Her explanations were starting to overlap in ways that didn't align. Times shifted slightly from telling to telling. Reasons changed depending on the audience. She spoke as if everything were already resolved, even when resolution required agreement she didn't have. She didn't notice. She didn't need to. Her confidence carried her forward, and no one wanted to slow it down by asking questions. Process entered the picture quietly, not with confrontation, not with raised voices, just with structure. A review that couldn't be postponed, a form that needed to be filled out, a routine step that required someone to explain things clearly, in order, without improvisation. She welcomed it. Of course she did. This was her moment to demonstrate how thoroughly she had everything under control. She stepped forward without hesitation, ready to speak, ready to clarify, ready to manage. I stayed where I was, present but unobtrusive, answering only when directly addressed, keeping my responses brief and factual. I didn't correct her when she spoke. I didn't confirm her version either. I let her talk. The waiting was the hardest part. Knowing what was at stake made every day feel heavier. There were moments when fear pressed in, asking if I should stop this before it went any further, if I should protect myself by breaking the silence. But I trusted the structure I had put in place. I trusted what was written, and I trusted that the truth didn't need my voice to survive. She kept explaining. She kept filling space. She kept committing her version of events to memory, to record, to expectation. With each sentence, she reduced her ability to retreat. I realized then that the counter move wasn't something I did at a single moment. It was something I sustained. A steady refusal to interrupt, a willingness to let her speak herself into permanence. There was a stillness that came with it. Not relief, not satisfaction. Just a focused calm. I wasn't trying to expose her. I was allowing exposure to happen naturally. She believed my silence meant agreement. She believed the absence of resistance meant consent. She expanded her role accordingly, confident that she was operating within boundaries no one would challenge. I watched her cross those boundaries one by one. By the time she finished explaining everything on record, I knew something had changed. Not outwardly, not yet. But internally, the story she'd been telling had stopped evolving. It was fixed now. She didn't realize it, but she had just reached the point where her words could no longer adjust to reality. They would have to stand on their own. I remained still, steady, and quiet, understanding that from this point forward, silence was no longer something I endured. It was something I used. Because once a story is written down, it stops belonging to the person who told it. And what remains is what can be proven. The review was presented as routine, which was exactly why no one questioned it. There was no sense of urgency, no hint of conflict. It was framed as a standard check, the kind that happened all the time. I took my seat quietly, neither defensive nor expectant, and let the room settle around us. My sister moved naturally into position, standing slightly forward, already prepared to speak. No one asked her to. No one needed to. She began explaining with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Her voice was calm, measured, and confident, the same tone that had carried her story through our family without resistance. She laid out my schedule as if it were settled fact, describing adjustments and timing with a fluency that suggested long familiarity. She never once looked at me. I noticed that immediately, not even a glance for confirmation, not a pause to invite agreement. She spoke as if my presence were symbolic rather than necessary. Others deferred to her without hesitation. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. The room accepted her authority because it had already been rehearsed in smaller spaces, repeated often enough to feel solid. As she continued, she began offering details no one had asked for. She explained why certain changes were made, how my body had responded, what considerations had gone into her decisions. Each addition sounded reasonable on its own. Together they began to stretch the timeline in subtle ways. Dates shifted slightly, reasons overlapped, explanations grew longer than required. I stayed still. When I was addressed directly, I answered simply. Short responses, factual, no elaboration. I didn't contradict her, but I didn't support her version either. I let the contrast exist without highlighting it. Inside, I felt the tension of restraint. Every instinct told me to speak, to clarify, to reclaim my voice in that moment. But I held back. This wasn't the place for emotion. This was the place for permanence. She kept talking. The more she spoke, the more complete her version became. She committed to specifics. She explained her reasoning with confidence, unaware that confidence doesn't translate well onto paper when it isn't supported by records. I realized then that she was building something she wouldn't be able to revise later. Her explanation was documented. Dates, times, decisions were written down carefully. The act of recording changed the atmosphere in the room. What had once been conversational was now formal. What had been flexible was becoming fixed. She didn't notice the shift. She continued as if she were still in control of the narrative, unaware that the rules had changed. When she finished, there was a moment of stillness. No one challenged her immediately. No one corrected her. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate. The kind of pause that happens when information needs to be processed rather than reacted to. She seemed satisfied, even relieved, as if she had just completed something successfully. She leaned back slightly, her role fulfilled. I sat quietly, feeling something settle inside me. Not triumph, not relief, finality. Her story had stopped evolving. For weeks it had shifted depending on who was listening. It had adapted to questions and smoothed over inconsistencies through repetition. But now it existed in one place, in one form, bound by what she had chosen to say when precision mattered. I didn't look at her. I didn't look at anyone. I focused on the weight of the moment instead, on the understanding that whatever happened next would no longer depend on how convincing she sounded. It would depend on alignment. The meeting moved on without drama. Next steps were mentioned casually. There was no confrontation, no accusation, just procedure. As we left the room, my sister spoke to me as if everything had gone exactly as planned. She was relaxed, confident, unbothered. She believed she had solidified her authority. I walked beside her, quiet and steady. Inside, I knew the opposite was true. Her words were no longer hers to adjust. They had been captured, preserved, and prepared for comparison. The flexibility she had relied on was gone, replaced by something far less forgiving. Documentation doesn't care about intention. It doesn't respond to tone. It doesn't soften under confidence. That understanding stayed with me long after we returned home. I moved through the rest of the day calmly, maintaining the same outward compliance I had practiced for weeks. But something had shifted irreversibly. She had spoken first, and she had spoken freely. That was all I needed. Later that night, alone, I replayed her explanation in my head, matching it against what I knew to be true. The discrepancies were clear now, impossible to ignore. Not dramatic enough to shock, but precise enough to matter. I felt a quiet certainty settle in. The story she had built was about to be measured against something it couldn't bend. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel vulnerable. I felt prepared. She believed the review had strengthened her position. She believed my silence meant acceptance. She believed the absence of resistance meant safety. She didn't realize that by speaking first, she had done exactly what I needed her to do. She had frozen her version of events in place. And once a story stops moving, it can finally be examined. I lay awake that night, listening to the quiet of the house, knowing that the next time her words were revisited, they wouldn't be judged by how confidently they were delivered. They would be judged by whether they matched what had always been there, unchanged, waiting, written down. The chart was placed on the table without ceremony. No one announced it, no one framed it as a turning point. It was simply there, printed and orderly, set beside the notes from the review as if it had always been meant to sit next to them. I watched as pages were aligned, dates matched, times compared. The discrepancy appeared immediately. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no sharp intake of breath. It was quieter than that. A pause. A slight narrowing of focus. Someone leaned closer, tracing a finger down the page, then back to the written explanation my sister had given. They didn't match. Her version described adjustments that weren't reflected anywhere on the chart. Times she had stated with confidence didn't exist in the record. A sequence she'd explained as deliberate simply wasn't there. The room shifted. Questions surfaced, not accusatory, just practical. Could she clarify this part? Could she explain why the documentation didn't reflect what she had said? The tone remained neutral, but something essential had changed. Her certainty no longer carried weight. She tried to respond calmly, leaning on the same confidence that had worked so well before. She explained that some things hadn't been updated yet, that certain changes were informal, that intent mattered. The chart didn't respond. Each time she offered clarification, the gap widened. A date she referenced couldn't be found. A reason she gave conflicted with an earlier explanation. The more specific she became, the harder it was to reconcile her words with what was written. I stayed still. No one looked at me for confirmation. No one asked me to defend or accuse. The attention had shifted entirely to her, to the task of making two versions align. They couldn't. For the first time, her authority worked against her. The role she had assumed required consistency, and consistency was exactly what was missing. The confidence that once smoothed over doubts now highlighted them. Silence filled the room, thicker than before. Not awkward, analytical. I felt a strange sense of distance, as if I were watching something complete itself without my involvement. I wasn't relieved, I wasn't vindicated, I was steady. There was a brief moment, almost imperceptible, when I remembered why I had stayed quiet. I saw myself weeks earlier standing in the kitchen, choosing not to correct a small error. That decision echoed now, not emotionally, but structurally. This was why. Her version began to unravel not because anyone challenged it, but because it had been allowed to exist long enough to be tested. She tried once more to explain, her voice tightening just slightly, the calm beginning to strain. The chart remained unchanged. At some point, the explanation stopped, not because she was interrupted, but because there was nowhere else to go. The discrepancy was acknowledged plainly. Not assigned blame, just noted. Her story was no longer viable. No one accused her of wrongdoing. No one questioned her motives. The process didn't need that. The only thing that mattered was alignment, and alignment was absent. I noticed then that she had grown quiet. The role reversal was subtle but unmistakable. She had become reactive, cautious, measuring her words the way I once had. Each response seemed weighed down by the awareness that anything she said would be checked. I understood what she was feeling. The outcome wasn't announced with finality, but it was inevitable. The correct schedule was identified. The discrepancy was recorded. Next steps were mentioned in practical terms. The point of no return had been crossed. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The story had moved beyond personal dynamics. It was no longer about who spoke with confidence or who stayed silent. It was about what could be verified. As the meeting concluded, there was no release of tension, no dramatic resolution, just the quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. Her version of events had collapsed under its own weight. We walked out together, the same way we had walked in. She spoke once, softly, as if testing whether her voice still held the same authority. It didn't. I responded briefly, neutrally. There was no satisfaction in the exchange, no sense of triumph, only clarity. Later, alone, I thought about how easily things might have gone differently. If I had confronted her early, if I had argued emotionally, if I had demanded to be heard before the story was complete. None of that would have led here. This outcome required patience. It required restraint. It required allowing her certainty to harden into something measurable. The collapse hadn't been loud. It hadn't needed to be. Her story had simply reached a point where it could no longer adjust to reality. And once that happened, there was nothing left for it to do but fall away. I understood then that this wasn't the end of the consequences, it was the beginning. Control had disappeared, and with it, the comfort she had found in managing the narrative. What came next would be quieter, slower, and far more difficult to navigate, for both of us. But one thing was certain now. The truth no longer depended on my voice. It was written, and it wasn't going anywhere. After the comparison, words stopped doing any real work. The room settled into a different rhythm, slower and more deliberate. No one raised their voice, no one argued. The discussion moved away from explanations and toward the chart itself, as if everyone had silently agreed that this was the only thing worth listening to now. My sister tried to recover her footing. She spoke about intent first, how she had only meant to help, how complicated things had become, how much responsibility she had taken on without complaint. The words sounded familiar, almost rehearsed, the same ones that had carried her through weeks of unquestioned authority. They were acknowledged politely, then set aside. No one dismissed her outright. No one accused her of anything. They simply returned to the document in front of them. Dates were read aloud, dosages confirmed, timelines clarified. Each reference pulled the conversation further away from tone and closer to fact. I watched her realize slowly that persuasion no longer mattered. The official correction was handled calmly. The schedule was restated clearly, aligned with the written record that had never changed. Any supposed adjustments were removed from consideration, not as a punishment, but as a correction. The language was careful and neutral, stripped of emotion. Authority shifted without announcement. I felt it before I saw it. The way questions that would have gone to her now hovered, then turned in my direction. The way my presence regained weight without me having to assert it. Nothing dramatic happened, no moment demanded recognition. It was simply understood. I was responsible for myself again. The reaction from the family was quiet but revealing. No one defended her version anymore. There were no attempts to reinterpret what had just happened. Some people avoided eye contact. Others sat very still, processing the change without commenting on it. The absence of debate said more than any argument could have. I didn't explain myself. I didn't describe what I had noticed or how long I had waited. The facts didn't require a narrator. They stood on their own, complete and unyielding. There was a strange release in that. Not relief exactly, but the easing of a pressure I hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. I hadn't needed to convince anyone. I hadn't needed to defend my experience. The structure had done it for me. My sister spoke once more, softly, as if testing whether the room would respond the way it used to. She asked a question about next steps, her voice careful, her confidence muted. The answer came from someone else. I saw it then, unmistakably. The shift wasn't just procedural, it was social. The authority she had carried so easily had dissolved, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. Her explanations were no longer necessary. Nothing had been taken from her directly. But everything that had sustained her position was gone. What struck me most was what didn't happen. No apology was demanded, no confession requested, no dramatic reckoning unfolded. There was no sense of victory to celebrate, just a correction, and with it a boundary that didn't need to be negotiated. As the meeting ended, I gathered my things slowly. My sister lingered for a moment, then moved aside to let me pass. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it carried weight. She wasn't leading anymore. We walked out together, the same way we always had. The hallway felt longer than before, quieter. She didn't speak, neither did I. Later, alone, I thought about how easily the outcome might have slipped away if I had acted sooner, louder, more emotionally. If I had demanded acknowledgement before the story was complete, it would have become a debate. And debates reward those who speak best, not those who are right. This hadn't been a debate. It had been a comparison. That distinction mattered more than I could have known at the beginning. I hadn't won by outmaneuvering her in conversation. I hadn't exposed her through accusation. I had simply allowed her certainty to stand beside something it couldn't override. The chart hadn't argued back. It hadn't softened in response to her explanations. It hadn't adjusted to make space for intention. It just existed. And that was enough. I felt steady in a way I hadn't for weeks. Not energized, not triumphant, just grounded. The quiet certainty that comes when something essential has been put back where it belongs. This wasn't the end of the consequences. I could feel that much. The aftermath would unfold slowly, in glances and hesitations and unspoken recalibrations. But the foundation had shifted, and it wouldn't shift back. Control, once lost, doesn't return quietly. As I prepared to move forward, I understood that this moment wasn't about punishing my sister or reclaiming pride. It was about something simpler and far more important. My body was mine again. My decisions were mine again. And the truth, once aligned with what had always been written, no longer needed me to protect it. It was already standing. The quiet afterward felt heavier than the confrontation that never happened. Life moved forward as if nothing had occurred. Meals were shared, conversations continued, schedules resumed, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, and everyone seemed to sense it without naming it. My sister stopped speaking for me. It didn't happen all at once. At first it was a hesitation, a pause when someone asked a question. She would open her mouth, then close it again, as if remembering something she hadn't needed to remember before. The silence would stretch, uncomfortable but instructive, until the question found its way to me. I answered calmly, briefly, without explanation. No one corrected me. The change was subtle, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. She no longer positioned herself between me and decisions. She didn't summarize my thoughts or translate my reactions. When appointments were discussed, people looked at me first. When instructions were clarified, they waited for my response. She deferred, awkwardly at times, deliberately at others, but unmistakably. I didn't acknowledge it. I didn't thank her or comment on the shift. I let it stand on its own, just as the correction had. The less attention it received, the more permanent it felt. The rest of the family adjusted in their own ways. Some acted as if they were embarrassed, careful not to reference the past too closely. Others became defensive, as if the change reflected poorly on them. No one wanted to revisit what had happened, and no one needed to. The power dynamic had already moved. I noticed who treated me differently now, who asked my opinion again, who waited for my answer instead of looking past me. The recalibration wasn't kind or cruel, it was practical. People follow the person they believe has authority, and authority had quietly returned to where it belonged. My sister's confidence didn't disappear overnight, but it changed shape. She spoke less. When she did speak, she was careful. Her explanations were shorter, stripped of the certainty that had once carried them effortlessly. The room no longer rearranged itself around her words. She was being measured now, not punished, not judged, simply observed. I felt no satisfaction in that, no sense of triumph, only a calm awareness that the balance had corrected itself. What she had lost wasn't status or dignity, it was unchecked influence. And what I had regained wasn't power over her, it was power over myself. When I spoke, people listened. Not because I demanded it, but because nothing contradicted me anymore. I didn't justify my choices or explain my reasoning unless it was necessary. I didn't defend my experience. I stated it. That was enough. The most surprising part was how little effort it took once the structure supported me. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or sharpen my tone. I hadn't needed to prove anything. The facts had done that work quietly, and the aftermath reflected it. There were moments when I saw my sister watching me, as if trying to understand when the shift had happened. I don't think she ever fully realized how long it had been in motion. From her perspective, it must have felt sudden, as if control had slipped away without warning. But I knew better. I had felt every step of it. I reflected often during that time, not on her actions, but on my own silence, on what it had cost me in the short term and what it had protected in the long run. Silence had not been passive. It had required restraint, patience, and trust in something larger than immediate relief. I learned the difference between being quiet and being powerless. Powerlessness is imposed. Silence can be chosen. That distinction mattered more than anything else this experience had taught me. I hadn't disappeared when I stopped speaking. I had repositioned myself. By the time I fully resumed my voice, the ground had already shifted. The story was no longer about my sister. It never really had been. She was only the most visible part of a system that rewarded confidence over truth and control over consent. What mattered now was that I was no longer trapped inside it. As days passed, the tension softened. Not because anything had been resolved emotionally, but because resolution didn't require emotion. The boundary held without reinforcement. The correction stood without explanation. I felt lighter, not because something had been taken from her, but because something had been returned to me. Autonomy. I didn't need closure from her. I didn't need an apology or acknowledgement. The silence between us had changed, and that change spoke clearly enough. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about what might happen next. I wasn't bracing for another adjustment or another explanation spoken over my head. I was simply living inside my own decisions again. And as I moved through those days, steady and unchallenged, one final realization settled in. This story was finished where it mattered most. What remained was not confrontation or repair, but something quieter and far more durable: freedom. And that was enough. The correction settled quietly, and that was how I knew it was real. No announcement followed it. No conversation marked the moment. My schedule returned to its original form without ceremony, aligned again with what had always been written. I checked it once, then again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel the steadiness of something that no longer shifted depending on who spoke. For the first time in weeks, my body responded the way it should have all along. The difference was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. The fog lifted. The strange heaviness faded. I moved through the day without bracing myself, without wondering what invisible adjustment might be waiting for me next. Control had returned, not as a dramatic victory, but as a quiet certainty. Life resumed its rhythm. Family conversations carried on without revisiting what had happened. No one apologized. No one explained. There were moments when someone tried to reframe the past, offering a softened version that suggested everything had been a misunderstanding. It didn't take. The boundary was already in place. It didn't need defending. I realized then how different winning felt from being free. Winning demands witnesses. Freedom doesn't. Freedom exists whether anyone acknowledges it or not. It settles into your body and stays there. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. My sister kept her distance, not physically, but conversationally. She no longer stepped in to manage or interpret. When she spoke, it was cautiously, without the certainty that had once carried her words so far. I didn't respond to that shift. I didn't need to. The absence of her authority spoke for itself. What surprised me most was how little energy it took to maintain this new balance. I wasn't policing anything. I wasn't watching for mistakes. The structure that had corrected the situation held on its own. My autonomy no longer depended on vigilance. That was the gift I hadn't expected. I reflected often on what silence had taught me. Not the silence of fear or avoidance, but the kind that comes from choosing not to spend energy where it won't matter. I learned that timing can protect you better than confrontation, and that restraint doesn't mean surrender. It means trust. Trust in facts, trust in process. Trust that truth doesn't require constant defense if it's allowed to exist long enough to be seen. This story was never just about my sister. It was about how easily control can be disguised as care, and how quickly a voice can be replaced when confidence steps in front of consent. It was about the danger of letting someone else narrate your experience because it sounds easier in the moment. And it was about what happens when you take that narration back without raising your voice. I didn't reclaim myself by arguing. I reclaimed myself by waiting until the truth could stand without me. There's a kind of dignity in that. As days passed, the tension faded completely. Not because everything had been healed, but because healing wasn't the goal. Stability was. And stability doesn't require emotional closure to function. It requires clarity. I moved forward with that clarity, unbothered by what wasn't said. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need acknowledgement. The correction itself was enough. It protected me in ways words never could. I understood then that some lessons only reveal themselves after the noise stops, when the urgency fades, when the story ends quietly instead of exploding. That's when you can hear what really mattered. I share this now because I know how common it is to be spoken for, corrected, managed, or quietly overridden by someone who sounds confident enough to convince everyone else. And I know how isolating it feels to recognize it while others nod along. If you've ever found yourself in that position, waiting for the right moment to be heard, I want you to know this. You don't always have to speak louder. Sometimes you just have to wait longer. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about a time when silence protected you, or when patience changed the outcome in a way confrontation never could. Share it in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, quiet ones about reclaiming control and dignity without shouting, you're welcome to stay here. Subscribe if you'd like to be part of this space, where truth doesn't rush and justice doesn't need to raise its voice. Some stories don't end with a fight, they end with things finally being set right. And that's enough.